This is 4 pounds of delicious local honey. Let's turn it into mead. This is mead. It's one of the most ancient and wonderful of drinks. Here, we didn't have sugar for a very, very long time. Yes, we have sugar beet now, etc., but it wasn't a known thing. We didn't really have vineyards and grapes for a long part of our history, but we've always had bees. Bees produce honey, and honey, sometimes the bees don't evaporate off as much water as they should from the honey, and it can start to naturally ferment in storage. So I can see how mead was created almost by accident originally, and then people realised that they were onto something there and carried on creating it. It's a fabulous drink. It's kind of almost fallen out of popular use now. I think partly because it's time consuming to make and therefore expensive if you buy it in the shops. But it doesn't have to be if you make it yourself. And that's what we're here to do today. There are as many types of meads as there are types of wine: dry, sweet, fruit, spice, all sorts of different types. And today we're going to make a mead that's a little bit on the sweeter side, because then all the sugars aren't fermented out and it still has that lovely honey flavour. It's great as a dessert wine, but it's also just great to sit and have a glass with good friends. The honey we're using comes from a local beekeeper. We used to keep our own bees, but unfortunately Fiona became very allergic to bee stings and we had to stop, but we still know a lot of people in the beekeeping community. And I'd encourage you to reach out to your local beekeepers. They're easy to find. They've usually got honey to sell. Get some honey, but find out what the bees were on as well. The bees on this honey were on field beans, but they were also on flowers of the lime trees that grow locally. A lime blossom can create a soporific effect when used in tea. They were also on rose bay willow herb. Now, why I'm saying to find out what the bees were on is if you create a fantastic mead, it's really useful to know what kind of honey you use so you can recreate it in the future. Today, as I say, a sweet dessert mead. Let's get going. I'm going to do this recipe as a day-by-day thing. So if you want to make it yourself, you can follow along. So we're on day 1. And if you want the full recipe and all the brewing instructions, they're in the description down below. Right, day 1, we're going to start our fermentation off in a bucket, not a demijohn. It's a clean, sterilised, lidded plastic bucket. And the reason I'm doing that is initial fermentations of wines and meads can be very violent. They can froth up like crazy. And they'll just froth straight through the airlock, make a big old mess. But if you do them in a bucket with a bit of room for that froth to occur, and when that violent initial fermentation dies down to a steady bubbling, then transfer them to the demijohn. So that's what we're going to do today. Your plastic bucket must be sterilised. I've sterilised this one. You can use either an egg cup full of plain unscented household bleach, fill the thing with water, leave it 15 minutes, empty it, rinse it at least twice, or there are a whole variety of winemaking sterilising powders on the market if you want to pay for the privilege. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my honey into a saucepan. And I'm going to add to it twice as much volume as there is honey. And then I'm going to boil it for about 20 minutes. Real honey contains things like little bits of beeswax, some pollen from the flowers, and we want to get all that out so that we end up with a lovely clear honey. While we boil it, it'll form a scum. We can skim that scum off, and that's any of the little bits of beeswax, etc., that we want to get rid of. I have to say, as that honey and water is heated up, the kitchen smells amazing. It's just got this fabulous, almost sort of hot toddy, hot honey kind of smell going on. Absolutely brilliant. It's one of the best brewing experiences. Whilst that's happening, I want to talk to you about some other things I'm going to put in the bucket today. We're going to add some more things tomorrow, because tomorrow we're actually going to start the fermentation with a specialist mead yeast. But today we want to get the must, the liquid, in the right state to ferment. So I'm going to add a few things to it. One of the things that I'm going to add is a thing called pectic enzyme. And pectic enzyme breaks down pectin. Pectin is the long strands of polysaccharide fibre that make your jam set. Right, so they're a great thing in jam. In wine, they make your wine cloudy. So if we add some pectic enzyme at this stage, wait 24 hours, it will break down any pectin that happens to be present, because obviously, you know, that honey's been gathered from a whole variety of plants. Some of them could have had pectin in them. So we want to break that down, get rid of it. Second thing I'm going to add is a crushed Campden tablet. They're small white tablets, and what they do is kill off any wild yeast that's been picked up with the nectar when the honey is formed, because we don't want those wild yeasts fermenting unpredictably and giving strange flavours. So we'd rather kill off any wild yeasts, use our known yeast, and we know what we're going to end up with that way. I'm going to add two other things. I'm going to add the grated zest of an orange. I'm going to add the grated zest of an orange because I think it just lifts the flavour a little bit of the honey. If you don't like the taste of orange, leave it out. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a teaspoon of something called acid blend. It's a mix of tartaric acid, malic acid and citric acid. What it does is slightly raise the acidity of the liquid, the wine must, and that makes it a much friendlier environment for yeast. Yeast likes a slightly acidic environment. If you don't have any, if you don't want to go to the trouble of getting some, you can get it from sort of wine homebrew shops. But if you don't want to do that, just put in about a tablespoon of lemon juice. It'll work absolutely fine. We will leave it for 24 hours for all of them to do their thing. When they've done their thing, we'll start the fermentation proper on day 2. Our mead has done its thing overnight. The pectic enzyme, the pectolase, has broken down any pectin that was naturally present and prevented that sort of haze or cloudiness affecting the quality of the mead. Campden tablet will have killed off any wild yeast that's present. So basically now we've got our mead in a state where we're ready to start fermentation. I'm going to do 3 things today on day 2. I'm going to create and add in a yeast starter culture. And we could just sprinkle in some dried yeast, but that takes a while to get going. So what I'm going to do is get some nice warm orange juice, room temperature orange juice. I'm going to put the yeast into that. Then I'm going to let that get all sort of frothy so the yeast is rehydrated and energized, and then I'll introduce that into the mead and get off to a flying start. Second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of tannin in the mead. Tannin, when you drink tea or wine and you get that slightly tooth-coating thick feeling, that's caused by tannin. Honey doesn't naturally have tannin in it, but that can make mead feel a little bit thin. So if we introduce some tannin, it just gives it more body, better mouthfeel. I'm going to introduce a little bit of grape tannin, which you can buy in powdered form from homebrew shops. But if you haven't got any and you don't want to invest in it, 2 or 3 tablespoons of strong black tea will do the job perfectly effectively. And the third thing that I'm going to cover very briefly today is creating the right environment for fermentation. It's cold here at the moment and we need this stuff to stay warm. So I'm going to use a heat pad to put these buckets onto to keep the whole sort of mead and yeast beautifully warm, so it starts that primary fermentation really well. If you keep it too cold, it can either stop working or it can create some off flavours. So warmth is your friend with fermentation. Let's get going. Okay, quick word on yeast. I'm using Cross Maloof Mead yeast today. That is a specialty yeast. Now, sometimes I will say to you, just use a general purpose wine yeast, it's fine. I don't think that's true of mead. Mead really benefits from the right strain of yeast. Cross Maloof Brew is a small homebrew shop that exists online. They do brilliant single sachets of yeast. I've used them a lot. I pay full price, but they are a good place to go when you want something a little bit out of the ordinary. And the other thing to note with this yeast is it's got yeast nutrient in the sachet with it. And for mead, that's really important. A lot of fruit wines, for example, there's enough nutrients in the fruit that the yeast will work just fine. Honey doesn't have those nutrients. So if you're in any doubt at all when you're making mead, make sure that you put some yeast nutrient in. If the yeast you're using doesn't come with that kind of nutrient added, then you can buy yeast nutrient. Just put a teaspoonful in your yeast starter culture with the yeast and that'll work fine. What I'm going to do now, open the sachet, put it into the glass, give it a stir, and then I'm going to leave it for 10 to 20 minutes until you can see it start to bubble up. We know it's activated and we'll introduce that into the mead. This is grape tannin or wine tannin, comes as a sort of mid-brown powder, and all I'm adding is 1/8 of a teaspoon to the mead. Let's talk about ideal conditions then for the fermentation. This is what I use. This is a heat pad. It's 20 odd years old, hence why it's kind of stained and marked, but it doesn't contact the brew in any way, so that really isn't a problem. And all I do is I put my brewing vessel, whether it's a bucket or a demijohn, on the heat pad, and that adds a bit of gentle warmth, keeps it at that lovely warm room temperature level that encourages a really good brew. You can get things like heat belts now and all sorts of other things, but what you want is a good consistent temperature around about 20 centigrade, 70 Fahrenheit, somewhere around there. And you don't want it to get cold at night, so don't use things like unheated outbuildings, etc. Keep your brew as warm as you can. If you haven't got any artificial heating, just keep it in as warm and consistent a temperature as you possibly can. That mead has been going now for 24 hours with the yeast start culture going in it, and primary fermentation's really kicked in. It's not massively foamy on this occasion, but there are lots and lots of bubbles rising to the surface, and it's giving that sort of snappy, crackly sound that it often does. We'll let that go a few days to calm down, then we'll filter off things like the orange zest, pop it into a demijohn for a calm secondary fermentation with an airlock. After a few days, we've passed the point of that primary fermentation with any risk of foaming through the airlock. So I want to get our mead into a demijohn. Now, as I do that, I want to remove the orange zest from the mead. It's given up all its flavours now. So what I'm going to do, take a clean, sterilised demijohn. I'm going to put a big funnel in it, and then I'm going to line that funnel with a very fine sieve and ladle the liquid from the primary fermenter into the demijohn through the sieve, and we'll get rid of all that orange zest in the process of getting it into the demijohn. And what we're going to see, once we've got that liquid in, is that the demijohn is not quite as full as it should be. And we do that deliberately because the easiest way of making it up to the full level is once it's in the demijohn and we can see the level. So when I do the primary ferment, I only use about 80% of the liquid that I really need. And then once it's in the demijohn, I can just top it up with clean, fresh water to the correct level. Finally, we'll fit an airlock, and we're doing something just a little bit different there. What we're going to do is put liquid vegetable glycerin into the demijohn rather than water, because it's much less likely to evaporate. And this mead fermentation is going to take many months to ferment out. It's a long process, but it is worth it. But by using vegetable glycerin, we avoid any risk at all of the water evaporating. Don't worry if you haven't got any, just keep an eye on the level of water in your airlock when you're passing. If it starts to look a little bit low, just top it up. And there we are. That's a gallon of sweet dessert mead in the making. It's going to take a while to ferment out that. So I will come back to it in about 3 months, and in 3 months I'll rack it off into another clean, sterilised demijohn. Racking off just means siphoning, but leaving behind all the sediment that would have been created by fermentation. Then I'll let it ferment even longer. Mead takes a long time to ferment out. It's full of complex sugars in that honey, and it does take longer than traditional country wines. But it's so worth being patient and doing it in a proper way. Once it's done, we'll go through the whole clearing, filtering, bottling process. And if you want to know what that looks like, I'll put a link up above to doing it with another form of country wine, but the process is almost the same. But when I've done it all, I will do a part 2 to this video just to show you what it looks like as we do it for mead, and we can talk about how long you need to mature the mead, etc. If you've enjoyed today's video, can you spare us 5 seconds? Give us a thumbs up down below. If you want to see more on different types of country wine, I'm thinking of doing some rice wine and making rice wine vinegar. Would that interest you? If so, let us know in the comments and we'll try and make that kind of video. We love to make the sorts of things that you want to see. And if you want to see those videos and everything else we produce, tap on subscribe down there, hit the bell next to it. It's a totally free service, but you get notified every time we upload a new video. For today, thanks for watching. Come back and see us soon. Take care.